Morning, ladies and gentlemen, if I may call you so. I am Mrs. van Reenen, and today I'm going to help you with the topic of reaction rate. Now, there are literally thousands of reactions taking place every day around us. If you look at this picture, you will see that we have just hold on a second. We have, for instance, combustion that takes place. Think of lighting a fire. When you light something like a cigarette, you don't know that anymore because you do the vaping stuff. But in any case, rust, the digestion process in your body, photosynthesis, cooking, washing, baking, fermentation, making wine and beer. All of these are everyday reactions, chemical reactions that take place. But these reactions do not take place at the same time. So what exactly is it when we talk about reaction rate? It refers to how fast a reaction takes place. These reactions differ in the time that they take place. And why is it so important for us to know how fast a reaction takes place? Well, if you later on want to go into industry, you want to become a chemical engineer or a chemist, then you will see that your boss is going to tell you that time equals money. And if you have to go and produce a chemical in a factory, in a laboratory, then the faster you can produce it, the less time it takes for you to produce it, the less money it's going to take or cost your boss. So reaction rates actually is going to mean a lot one day when you work for somebody in a factory or in some place like Sasol, for instance. So we are going to investigate now how we can measure the rate of a reaction. We are going to look at the factors that influence the rate of a reaction. And further, we are going to use the collision theory to explain how each of these factors influence the reaction rate. Now, sorry, I'm going to take you back to grade 11 because there's a lot of the energy and change topic from grade 11 that we are going to build on in this topic. Now, halfway through grade 11, about this time in grade 11, you did the topic energy and change. And this is from your CAPS document or your exam guidelines. And there we did the following. We defined heat of reaction, or delta H, as the energy absorbed or released in a chemical reaction. We also defined the exothermic reaction as reactions that release energy, endothermic reactions as reactions that absorb energy. So we stated that if a reaction has a delta H that is greater than 0 or positive, then the reaction will be endothermic. If the delta H is smaller than 0 or negative, then the reaction will be exothermic. So how did we calculate heat of reaction? Now, the heat of reaction is the difference in the energy between the reactants and products. Now, the energy we're talking about here is the potential energy. So we usually would have said delta H is the energy of the products minus the energy of the reactants. It was measured in kilojoules per mole. So when we did this calculation and we got an answer greater than 0, then we could say the reaction was endothermic. And when it was less than 0, the reaction was exothermic. Then there's different ways that they can indicate for you in an equation if a reaction is endo or exothermic. First example is very, very straightforward. They give you an equation. So for example, the one that we have here, magnesium and hydrochloric acid reacts, and they give you magnesium chloride and hydrogen that form. Now, what is very important is this part here. This is straightforward. They give you delta H is less than 0. So from what we've learned, this means that the reaction is exothermic. Right. It's not always going to be so straightforward. In certain instances, they're going to give you a reaction that looks like this. There is no delta H indicated, but they give you a plus heat. Now, what does that mean? That actually tells us that for this reaction to take place, heat is actually part of the reactant. So we need heat for this reaction to take place. So this is another way of saying that this reaction is actually endothermic. Heat is needed, so heat must be absorbed for this reaction to take place. Then a third way, which is also a little bit straightforward, is where they tell you the value of delta H, and the value in this case is negative 92 kilojoules per mole, and that negative tells us then that the reaction is exothermic. Now, just want to show you another example. They can, for instance, tell you, and I'm just taking any reaction now. Let's say they give you A plus B is C plus D plus energy. If they give you something like this, then this means energy is released. And this is another way of saying that this reaction is exothermic. So that's just another way of also telling you what your forward reaction is. You will hear I'm talking about a forward reaction. The next topic that you will do in chemistry is chemical equilibrium, and there we're going to use forward and reverse reactions. Right. If we now go to the next important thing, is for any reaction to start, we need a certain amount of energy. And that energy is called the activation energy. Now, the definition that comes from last year is that the minimum energy needed for a reaction to take place is called the activation energy. And we had graphs last year of potential energy versus the cause of the reaction, where we indicated a little hill, and that hill was called the activated complex. And what is the activated complex? That was the unstable transition state from reactants to products. That is basically where the bonds got broken and the atoms rearranged to form the new products. So activation energy, we use usually E with a little a, and it is also energy, so it's also measured in kilojoules per mole. Now, if we go to the graphs later on, the activation energy will be the difference between the energy of the reactants and the energy of the activated complex. Now, let's look at these potential energy graphs that show the potential energy as the reaction takes place. And we're first going to look at an exothermic reaction. Now, this might look familiar to you. This is what we did last year as well. So if we look at the potential energy on the axis here, we have potential energy. We start here with the reactants. This is the energy of the reactants. And then you will see there we've got the activated complex. And that is the energy then of the activated complex. And the difference between these two energies is what we call the activation energy. And then when we now go from the activated complex down and we end here, this is the energy of the products. And if we now take the difference between the energy of the reactants and the energy of the products, we usually say products minus reactants. And because we end lower at the products, this answer is going to be negative. And that is going to give us that delta H is less than 0, which tells us that this reaction is exothermic if you did the calculation. So this should not be something new to you. This is what you did last year already. Right, so now let's do the endothermic one. Again, if we look at where we start here, this is the energy of the reactants. Then we go up, we talk a little about the little hill that we have here. This is where the activated complex is. Again, the energy between the activated complex and that of the reactants. This energy difference is the energy of the activation energy, the minimum energy needed for the reaction to take place. Then if we go from the activated complex down to where the energy is of the products, you can see that we now end higher than where we were. So that means this amount of energy was actually absorbed during the reaction. And that's that plus energy that I showed you earlier. So now if we work out the delta H, we have a higher value minus a lower value. And that gives us that delta H is now going to be greater than it was before. It's going to be a positive value. Now, we talked about collision theory as one of the ways to explain the factors and how they influence reaction rate. So let's look at what we want to explain it with. Now, at this stage, we're going to look at the macroscopic factors that influence reaction rate when we're looking at collision theory. It assumes that reactions occur as a result of collisions between the reacting particles, and that only effective collisions results in a reaction. Now, there's two conditions for an effective collision. This is very important. The reacting particles must have sufficient or enough kinetic energy. Remember, kinetic energy is the energy of movement, the speed at which they are moving. And then secondly, they must have the correct orientation. Orientation refers to how they hit each other. At what angle they hit each other? Do they hit each other at the bonds where the double bonds maybe are so that the bonds can be broken? Things like that. So when we're now going to look at explaining with the collision theory the factors and how they influence the rate, we will always have to refer to the particles' kinetic energy. Is it sufficient or not? And if they have the correct orientation. So how much energy is sufficient kinetic energy? Well, we've obviously now said that the reaction can only take place if the minimum energy is there. So what was the minimum energy? That was the activation energy. So the kinetic energy of the colliding molecules must be equal to or bigger than the activation energy for a specific reaction. Remember, the activation energy is the minimum energy needed for a reaction to take place. So only the particles or molecules that have kinetic energy equal to or bigger than activation energy can actually have sufficient energy for this reaction to take place. And then just remember, all the molecules do not move at the same speed. They do not all have the same kinetic energy. Now, last year we had also exposed you guys to the Maxwell-Boltzmann distribution curve. Now, this curve tells us, first of all, here the number of particles, and on this curve, the kinetic energy that the particles have, starting here with 0, going there to the most energy. So if we look at this region here, most of the particles have moderate energies. And then as we move along that way, we can see that the amount of molecules are decreasing, and then a very few, very little of our molecules have very high kinetic energy. All right, so now, sufficient kinetic energy. We now go and we draw in the activation energy. So let's say this is the activation energy. So this is the energy that is equal to the kinetic energy that the molecules must have to be able to have sufficient energy for the collisions to take place. So all the molecules now to the right of this line here will have sufficient kinetic energy. So that means under this curve, only these molecules here will be able to collide with sufficient kinetic energy. And all the rest here can collide, but nothing will happen because they don't have sufficient kinetic energy. So our goal is then to see how we can increase the number of molecules that have sufficient kinetic energy so that the rate of the reaction can take place faster. The second condition for the reaction to take place was correct orientation. Now, I don't know how many of you can actually identify this molecule. We, in the first term, did organic chemistry. So if you look at these two, it's two carbons, and we have two hydrogens here and two hydrogens here and a double bond. So this is your ethene molecule. And this could be something like hydrogen chloride. Now we know that if hydrogen chloride reacts with ethene, that double bond there can break, and we can actually have an extra hydrogen on the one carbon and a chloride on the other carbon. So if we now look at how this collision takes place, the chloride hits it from this side, and this is not where the bond is. That must break, so nothing's going to happen. If we look on this side here, the two hydrogens are going to collide, still not at the right orientation, not the right place to go and collide. We want the collision to take place there. So this collision means absolutely nothing, even if there is sufficient kinetic energy. But here, the collision takes place perfectly in the right orientation, and if we have also sufficient kinetic energy, the bond will break and the reaction will take place. This is another example. We've done acids and bases last year, and you're going to revise it again this year. So we have water here, and we have hydrogen chloride. Now, from last year, you would know that when these two react, the hydrogen should be taken over to the water molecule to form the hydronium ion. But we've never actually looked microscopically at how this is happening. So if we now look at this collision taking place, the oxygen and the chloride are colliding. And this is not going to help us at all, because the oxygen is the atom that must take the hydrogen away from the chloride. And in this orientation, it's not going to happen. So after the collision, just go back to their original positions, no reaction taking place. But if the collision takes place like this, the hydrogen then lies between these two, and oxygen grabs the hydrogen away from the chlorine, and now we form the hydronium ion and the chloride ion. And that is a perfect scenario for us where the acid-base reaction takes place, the hydronium ion has formed, and the chloride ion has formed. Another example of correct orientation. Right, so we've looked at the two things that must take place for a reaction to be correct. There must be sufficient energy, kinetic energy, and that means it must be equal to or greater than the activation energy, and there must be correct orientation of the molecules or particles. Now let's look at the factors that will influence the reaction rate further. First thing is the nature of the reactants. We're not going to look at this in much detail, but this actually looks at the complexity of your molecules. And a lot of times this has to do with the intermolecular forces as well. Next thing is the concentration of the reactants. Now, that obviously has to do with how many molecules you have or particles you have in a certain volume. When we work with gases, we're going to look at make the concentration bigger or smaller by changing the volume or increasing the pressure. Temperature at which the reactions occur, that's the third one. Then the surface area, if there's a solid as a reactant or even as a catalyst. And the final one is a catalyst, to add a catalyst to the reaction. Now we're going to start with the effect of a temperature, if there's an increase in temperature and what that's going to do. Now, all particles are in motion, but they do not move at the same speed. Now, this we know already from grade 8, when you started with the kinetic molecular theory. Therefore, the particles of a substance have different kinetic energy. However, the temperature of a substance is directly proportional to the average kinetic energy of the substance particles. So guys, this is very important. The temperature is directly proportional to the average kinetic energy. The word average must be there. The kinetic energy is different for the different molecules, but it's the average kinetic energy that is directly proportional to temperature. What does that mean? That means that as the temperature increases, the average kinetic energy will increase as well. So as the temperature increases, that also means that the particles will move faster and that they will collide more per unit time. What effect will this now have on our Maxwell-Boltzmann curve? Now, if we look at this curve, this green line is the original temperature. Let's say this was room temperature. And this line here indicates the activation energy. And we only had this little portion here of particles that had sufficient kinetic energy for the reaction to take place. If we now go and let this reaction take place at a higher temperature, so T2 is at a higher temperature, then what happens, first of all, that you have to realize is this little hill goes down and it moves to the right. It's a little bit flattened, so it spreads out. And what is more, it also flattens out here. So now we have a very, very big area here underneath the curve. A lot more of particles now have energy more than the activation energy. So there's a lot more collisions that can take place with sufficient kinetic energy. So how will they ask this for you guys in the exams? Most of the time, they will give you the original curve. And they will ask you to redraw it in your exam book and then draw in a graph where the temperature is higher. So then you must remember that you have to label this graph, let's say as temperature 1 or the lower temperature, and then you draw in your new higher temperature. And to remember, when you draw this in, the hill must be lower and it must shift to the right. This activation energy line does not move, all right? But this curve here lies above the green one, much higher than the green one, so that this total area now is much bigger under the pink graph. So make yourself ready that you can be asked to draw this graph in an exam to explain how the temperature or increase in temperature what effect it will have on the Maxwell-Boltzmann curve. The next thing is, instead of asking you to draw the curves, they can ask you to explain it by means of the collision theory. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is a recipe, and if you are good at memorizing stuff, you can really do well in studying these things now. So what are they going to expect from you? The very, very first thing is you have to go and tell them that at a higher temperature, the average kinetic energy of particles increase. And don't forget that word average, all right? At a higher temperature, the average kinetic energy of the particles increase. What does that now mean? That means more particles have sufficient or enough kinetic energy. Remember, that was one of the conditions for the collisions to take place. So now we have more effective collisions that can take place. And again, you can't stop here. You have to have those words, per unit time. All right? And then lastly, so the reaction rate will increase. Usually, the first three bullets here, that is your marks. So you will get mark first, higher temperature, the average kinetic energy of particles increases. Then, more particles have sufficient kinetic energy. What does that mean? There's more effective collisions, and what must we not forget? Per unit time. And therefore, the reaction rate increases. Now, what if they asked you, what is the effect of a decrease in temperature? Well, then you're just going to do the opposite. So then you're going to say at a lower temperature, the average kinetic energy is going to decrease. So less particles will have enough kinetic energy, less effective collisions will take place, and the reaction rate will decrease. Right. But guys, this is an easy 3 marks that you should have. There's nothing else. You just have to go and memorize it. It's a recipe that you can go and study, and that is easy marks. And they love asking temperature, the effect of temperature. Okay. So next we're going to look at concentration, and especially what effect it has first on the Maxwell-Boltzmann curve. Now, what is concentration again? Just for those of you who might have forgotten, concentration was the number of moles over volume. So this is our particles. Right? So if we have a greater concentration, it means we will have more particles in a certain volume. And the more particles there are, the more effective collisions can take place. So if we now go to this curve, then B would be the first, let's say, original concentration curve. All right. And here is my activation energy. Okay. Now, if I now, let's say, double the concentration, then suddenly everything else stays the same, but it's my hill that has increased, that is now higher. And then it goes down, so everything else is just lying above the previous graph, but it starts at the same place and it ends at the same place. And if we look at this part here now, we have much more particles that have energy above the activation energy. Now, if we have to explain this with collision theory, Again, there's a recipe. All right. So what's the first thing? We start with what they stated or what they asked. How will the increase in concentration, what effect will it have? So we start with higher concentration. What does that mean? Now remember what I said about more particles there? When there's a higher concentration, we have more particles per unit volume. So where did we get that? That comes from our formula, C equals N over V. So again, higher concentration, more particles per unit volume. First mark. Secondly, what does that mean? More particles will have the correct orientation, or more collisions per unit time will take place. So there will be more effective collisions that take place per unit time. Again, don't forget per unit time, so the reaction rate will increase. All right, so remember when you work with concentration, again, I'm going to put it in here for you. This part here, where does it come from? It comes from that formula. So if there's a higher concentration, you don't have to go and memorize this out of your head if you remember this formula. What does a higher concentration mean? More particles per unit volume. All right, then after that, what does that mean? There's more particles that will have the correct orientation. All right, so more effective collisions per unit time. Reaction rate will increase. But your first 3 marks, or the marks that you will get, is for those first 3 bullets there. All right. So again, they can ask it in 2 ways, the effect of an increase in concentration. Either they ask you to draw the Maxwell-Boltzmann graph, and again, they can ask you to redraw it in your book. First, they give you the original graph. You have to redraw it with the higher concentration on it, or you have to explain it using the collision theory. All right. Next thing we're going to look at is the effect of surface area. Another way of talking about surface area is how finely divided the reactant is. Okay, so let's say we have the following. We have magnesium that reacts with hydrogen. Well, the hydrogen ions, actually I want to say it's something like this, magnesium plus hydrogen chloride, but then this splits up and it's actually the hydrogen ions now that's going to react with the magnesium. So if we look at the hydrogen atoms, or ions, sorry, and we have one big piece here of magnesium. So the little atoms of hydrogen, that is represented with these little red dots. They can only now collide with those magnesium atoms that is on the outside. They cannot collide with the guys that are here in the inside. So actually it's only a few atoms that they can get hold on and can collide with. So this is usually when we have a very big piece, we talk about a lump of magnesium. If we now go and we divide that, we split the magnesium into smaller bits. Now we can get into or in between to those ones here that we couldn't reach. The hydrogen can now go in between and it can actually get to more magnesium atoms. And in that way, we've actually now increased the surface area, or the number of atoms that can collide with one another. So the more finely we divide a solid, the greater the surface area becomes. Now let's explain this with the collision theory. All right, so with a greater surface area, or you could say state of division, more particles are exposed per unit volume. All right, so this is not per unit time. This is again per unit volume, like we had with concentration. Again, more particles will have the correct orientation, or more collisions will per unit time can take place. There will be more effective collisions per unit time, and the rate will increase. You can either use greater surface area or state of division. Right, you don't have to use both, but that is the statement that you start with. Greater surface area, more particles are exposed per unit volume. Now, if you look at what we have in this last part, more particles are exposed per unit volume, then that is exactly what we had with concentration increase. So when you have to draw the graph, Maxwell-Boltzmann curve, for a greater surface area, it will look exactly the same as it was for an increase in concentration. So I'm not going to redraw that graph. Just make a note that the graph for a greater surface area is the same as an increase in concentration. Right, now next one is catalyst. Let's first look at the definition of a catalyst. It's a substance that increases the rate of a chemical reaction without itself undergoing a permanent change. Now, a catalyst provides an alternative path of lower activation energy. Alternative path. It's not that it makes the activation energy for the reaction lower. It gives just an alternative path with lower activation energy. Sorry. This is an illustration of that. One guy decides to move over the hill with the wheelbarrow. Another guy got a shortcut along the side and just rolls it down. So you can decide which path you want to take. So when the catalyst is there, he gives the people, or well, in this case, the molecules then, an alternative path, which is much easier to follow. And in that way, he creates a faster reaction to take place. So in our potential energy reaction coordinate, or how the reaction takes place, in this graph, we also had this last year, where this was the hill where the activation energy is without the catalyst. The dotted line, this is now the lower energy with the catalyst. So there's still two ways. Some of the particles can still go that route, but there's now an alternative way for them to go. And that makes the whole reaction then take place much faster. Again, this is one of the graphs that they can ask you to draw. They can ask you to redraw, giving you the activation energy without the catalyst, and then redraw it in your book, showing the path or showing how it would look like with a catalyst. And then remember that with the catalyst, we draw it with the dotted lines. Just want to erase all of this. So remember here, we make use of the dotted lines to indicate this is the path of the catalyst, but it's always also good to put a key in. So you indicate this is with catalyst on your graph so that they know what you are referring to. All right. Something they also love to ask is this graph. Okay, now Maxwell-Boltzmann curve, how will that change if we now add the catalyst? Now, let's say This is the activation energy usually without the catalyst. With the catalyst, there's now a path of lower activation energy. So lower activation energy means the activation energy moved to the left. So this is the new lower activation energy. So what now happened is the rest of the graph did not change, but we now include all of these particles as well. They all now have sufficient kinetic energy for effective collisions to take place. So with these two graphs in mind, let's now explain with the collision theory what the effect is of a catalyst. So the first line, important that you state that the catalyst provides a path of lower activation energy. Don't go and say the catalyst lowers the activation energy. You have to say it provides a path of lower activation energy. Then we have more particles have sufficient kinetic energy, more effective collisions per unit time, and the rate of the reaction is going to increase. Right, now catalyst is also one of the factors that are asked a lot, like temperature. Okay, so now we're ready to actually go to the rate of the reaction and to go and measure it. Let's define now rate of reaction. Rate of reaction is the change in concentration of reactants or products per unit time. Consider, for example, the reaction represented by the following equation. Let's say we have A, which is a solid, B, which is in solution. That gives us then C, that is in solution, and D, that is a gas. We can measure the rate of this reaction by measuring how fast one of the reactants, A or B, is used up, or how fast the product, C or D, is formed. So it depends on what is the easiest to measure. The type of measurements we could perform would depend on the phase of the reactant or products under consideration. Now, usually with products, with reactants, it's always very easy to measure a solid, its mass, and how its mass decreases during a reaction. It's very difficult to measure the guys that are in solution. Then again, another one that is easy to measure is a product that is in gas form. Initially, the gas will have no volume, or there will be zero gas, but then we can collect the amount of gas that forms over time. So this is the two that we usually would like to collect, either how the mass of a solid decreases or the volume of a gas increases. They are the easiest to measure. Now you will see that when we talk about reactants, reactants are going to be used up, right? They are going to decrease as the reaction takes place. And then if we talk about products, products will be formed, so their concentration or amount will increase. Now, how are we going to calculate reaction rate? These are the formulas that we can use. If we look at products, we can look at the change in concentration. We can use the change in mass, change in volume, or the change in moles over time. Remember that rate is always how fast something happens, so we're always going to divide by time. Then if we look at reactants, we can again go and look at how fast the concentration changes, the mass changes, the volume changes, or the mole changes. Now, what does delta mean again? That delta means change in, and it is usually a final value minus an initial value that we will have to go and measure. Now, I hope you guys have seen that there is a minus sign in front of all the formulas for reactants. And that is because, by definition, the rate of a reaction is always positive. We're just going to say how fast the reaction is. We're not going to say it is minus 2 something. So how are we going to, why, let's say, is that negative there? I already explained previously that if a reactant is used up, what does that mean in terms of final minus initial? That's going to mean that if I now do a calculation, it's going to be something like 5 minus 10. And 5 minus 10 is going to give me negative 5. Now, negative 5 is not positive. So how can I make that positive? We can make that positive by putting negatives in front of each of those formulas. So that negative sign there is very important. You cannot leave it out. It's because our reactants decrease. So all the answers of those delta C, that part there, all of those are going to be negative. And then multiplied by the negative in front will give us an answer that's going to be positive. Now let's look at the units. Depending on what formula you use, that unit must be used. And then remember, we divide by time, so it will then be per second. So if we work with concentration, it will be mole per cubic decimeters per second. If we use the change in mass, it will be grams per second. If we use a change in volume, it will be per cubic decimeters. Sorry, this must not be per, it must just be, change in volume will just be cubic decimeters per second, and then moles per second. So your unit is all depending on what formula you use. So what was it that you measured the change of? Now let's look at how we are actually going to measure this change. There's a lot of things that we can look at that can change during an experiment. Now, unfortunately, this question is always structured as a practical or experimental question. So there's something that's going to be changed that we are going to change, and that is obviously going to be your independent variable. So we might be changing the temperature of the reactants. We can change the concentration of one of the reactants. We can change the division of a reactant of a solid. So we can start with it as a lump and then divide it fine and fine until we get to powder. We can change the pressure or volume of a gas. So what we do in each experiment and how we change that, the temperature, concentration, volume, etc., that will be the independent variable. And then we're going to measure the effect that it will have. But if we now change the temperature, then all the other factors must remain unchanged. And they will then be our controlled variables. So then, how will we measure the rate of the reaction? We will have to measure how fast the volume of the gas is collected, if the gas is a product, or we will have to measure how fast a solid as a reactant's mass decreases, how fast the precipitate forms as a product. We will have to look maybe at how fast a certain color change takes place, the pH can change, or the temperature can change. And these now will form your dependent variable. Very important, reaction rate is inversely proportional to the change in time. So the shorter the time, the greater the reaction rate will be. Now, this is one picture of an experiment that they might give you, where you have a reaction taking place here, and you can see that there's bubbles forming, and now the gas goes up here in the tube. You have a gas syringe, and usually it's measuring from here. This point here would be 0, and as it goes that way, the volume then increases. You have some kind of stopwatch here where you can measure the time, and every so many seconds you read of the volume of gas that is formed. And then you go and draw a graph. In this case, we collected the volume of gas that was formed. Now, why do we start at 0? The gas here was a product. And a product always will start at 0. And then with time, probably let's say every 10 seconds, you measure the volume and you go and plot your graph over time. And then we will see that this graph, the gradient of this graph changes. It is the steepest here at the beginning. So if I draw a line there, I draw a tangent line there, and I draw a tangent line there, all those gradients look different. And they are decreasing. Now, why are they decreasing? That actually tells us that the reaction is the fastest at the beginning and that it's slowing down. Now, if you think about it, in the beginning, reactants, their concentration is very big. But as they react, their concentration decreases, and that makes the reaction start to slow down. And then the moment we get to a part where the graph is horizontal, that actually means there's no more of the gas forming. That tells us now the reaction has stopped. And that is when your gradient is 0. Right. So that is how we have to analyze this graph. Now they can give you a table where the readings are given with the time and the volume, and then expect you to go and draw this graph. Or they can give you the graph with values on it and then ask you to read from the graph at a certain time what was the volume, or to go and work out the rate of the reaction for a certain time period. The other way of measuring the rate is when we have a solid whose mass is decreasing. Now, in this case, we have the reaction of hydrogen chloride with calcium carbonate. Now, the calcium carbonate is a solid, and we let this reaction take place on a scale. So initially, before you put the hydrochloric acid in, before you add it, you measure the mass. Then immediately when the hydrochloric acid is added, you measure the mass, and you close the top and you start the stopwatch. And then you record every few seconds, and again you can draw a graph. And this time we do not start at 0, we start somewhere along the line there. Now, what will that be? That would be the initial mass of the calcium carbonate that you put into the flask. And now over time, we can see that initially we had a very steep gradient, and the gradient is decreasing. And here we have horizontal part where it's 0. So what does that now mean? That means that here the reaction stopped. Now, the fact that the reaction stopped here and there's still some of the calcium carbonate left actually tells us one more thing. And that is that the calcium carbonate was not the limiting reactant, but was in excess. So the HCl might be used up, and that's why the reaction stopped. But this is another way that they can ask you the experiment and how to measure the reaction rate. Then another one that they like quite a lot is the formation of a precipitate. Now this reaction is where we use sodium thiosulfate and we let it react with hydrochloric acid. And in the process, there is a yellow precipitate of sulfur formed. So this reaction, we have an Erlenmeyer flask. We put it on a tile. We have usually a black cross that we mark underneath it. Both these solutions are colorless initially, but then as the reaction takes place, we have this yellow precipitate that forms, and it becomes more opaque, the color, until eventually we can't see, over time, we can't see that cross anymore. So the reaction is observed from the top through the flask. We view it, and we are measuring the time until the X is totally obscured, and we note the time that it has taken for that. So just in color, you will see here, first colorless, it becomes partially visible until we can't see it, and then you stop the stopwatch. Now, we can do this in two ways. We can either now repeat this by changing the temperature of the concentration of sodium thiosulfate, or we can use different and we keep the concentrations the same. So we keep these concentrations the same, but we change the temperature, or we can keep the temperature the same and we change one of these two concentrations. Let's say we change the concentration of the hydrochloric acid, and we repeat the reaction, the experiment, and every time we measure how fast it takes for the cross to disappear. Now, it's important that the total volume of this flask stays the same, so that the total amount of sulfur that forms every time is the same for the cross to become invisible. Reaction rate, remember, is equal to the inverse of time. For the cross to become invisible, the same amount of precipitate is formed in each case. And therefore, we can actually take it as a constant, and we replace it in our equation as a 1, so that it's all about that time value that's going to tell us what reaction is going to be the fastest. Right, then I have spoken about this actually already a little bit. If you have a reaction like this, A plus C gives you B plus D. We can either have a graph where we have the concentration of a reactant, let's say A, that changes over time, or the concentration of a product B that changes over time. And this curve shows us in both cases that the reaction rate is not constant. The reactants concentrations decrease and the products concentrations increase over time. The gradient of these curves do not stay the same, even if we measure them at certain times, like on this curve for A. If I measure it at P, and then I go and measure it at R, those values are not going to be the same. The reaction rate changes over time. So when we measure it, they're also going to ask you to measure it for a certain time interval. So they'll ask you maybe to measure it for that time interval, or they'll ask you to measure it for that time interval, but they'll give you a specific time interval over which you measure the reaction rate, because it doesn't stay constant. Right. Now, if you look here again, where A has ended, it didn't end at 0, so there's still A of A left. So that again tells us that A was in excess and that C was the limiting reactant. And then always remember that your products will start at 0 concentration. This is just another curve where they actually can give you both a product and a reactant on the same axis system. And what is interesting, what I wanted to show you here, is in this case, if you look there, your number of A, so we will say, if you look at this, A would be the reactant. How do I know that? It doesn't start at 0. B starts at 0, so this guy would be my product. And if I look at where A ended, it ended at 0. So that means A was used up. And that is why the reaction then stopped. So there's a lot of information that you can get from these graphs. Usually, if they give you something like this, they can ask you who was the reactant or who was the product, because they only gave you their A or B. And you have to go and remember that your product is always the guy that's going to be at 0 in the beginning. And the one that does not start at 0, that would be the reactant. Right, I'm going to go through one or two old exam questions with you just to give you an idea of how it can be asked. One of the definitions that you'll definitely get, if you go through almost all the exam papers, this is going to be asked. Define the term reaction rate in words. It's the change in concentration of products or reactants per unit time. It's usually 2 marks. Mark it very NB in your notes. You have to know this. Right, then they can give you something like this, a table. Now, if we look at this, they say learners use the reaction between impure powdered calcium carbonate and excess hydrochloric acid to investigate the reaction rate. All right, so now we have a balanced equation there. Calcium carbonate, which is a solid, plus hydrochloric acid gives us calcium chloride, water, and CO2. They perform 4 experiments under different conditions of concentration, mass, and temperature, as shown in the table. They use identical apparatus in the 4 experiments and measure the volume of gas released in each experiment. Right. The results of the experiment 1 and 3 are compared in the investigation. Write down the independent variable and the dependent variables. Now, if we look at experiment 1 and 3, what there stays the same and what changed? If we look at the concentration of the acid, then for both cases it is 1. The mass of the calcium carbonate stays 15. But what was changed in experiment 1 and 3 was the temperature of the acid. And remember, what we change from one experiment to the next, that will be the independent variable. So what did we change there? Temperature. So that will be the independent variable. Then what did we measure? What did we measure? I highlighted there at the top. Measure the volume of gas released. So you can either say the rate of the reaction or the volume of gas formed per unit time. Right. Then use the collision theory to explain why the reaction rate in experiment 4 will be higher than that in experiment 3. So now we're focusing on experiment 3 and 4. So if I look at 3 and 4, they have the same concentration of acid. They are at the same temperature of 40 degrees Celsius, but the difference lies in the mass of calcium carbonate. Okay, so experiment 4, there's a greater mass. Now, what does mass give us? The larger mass basically gives us a greater surface area. So there will be more effective collisions per unit time. There will be more particles that will collide with sufficient kinetic energy and correct orientation per unit time. All right. So it's important that you first see what is the difference. So I would have said there's a larger mass, which then means there's going to be a greater surface area. I would refer to both of them. More effective collisions will take place per unit time. There will be more particles with the correct sufficient kinetic energy or correct orientation per unit time. Both of them will be correct. You don't have to say that it is going to increase. We already know experiment 4 will go faster, because they stated it. Okay. Now, this is an interesting one. They give you 4 graphs, A, B, C, and D, and which one of the graphs represent experiment number 1? Fully explain the answer by comparing experiment 1 with 2, 3, and 4. All right. Now, I'm going to analyze this with you. And I feel that this is something that when you get your exam paper and that you do it on your paper, go and write in all of these things, and then you can go and formalize your answer. Now, the first thing that we can go and write in is, remember the acid was in excess and the calcium carbonate was a limiting agent. So that tells me that the mass of the calcium carbonate will determine the volume of the CO2. So if we look at this graph, we are looking at the volume of the CO2 is given to us. So in B, C, and D, the volume was the same where it ended, but in A, it ended higher. All right. So if I then go and I look at experiment number 4, which is totally different than B, C, and D. It's a steeper gradient and it's got a higher volume. And I've circled it there at the bottom for you guys. It had a higher mass of calcium carbonate and it had a higher temperature, the higher temperature. So that would probably then be experiment 4 that goes with graph A. It's got the biggest mass and the highest temperature, experiment 4. So A must have, so experiment 4 must have the steepest gradient and also then the greatest rate and the most product. And therefore it must go with graph number A. Right. Then the other one that stands out is the 0,5. That was the lowest concentration of acid. So that would probably then be one of the guys that is the lowest reaction rate. So if I then go to the lowest reaction rate, that would probably be D. Lowest concentration, right, is experiment 2's gradient is the least steep, thus it has the lowest rate. Okay, so that would probably be experiment number 2. So now we're left with B and C. Now experiment C has the same mass of calcium carbonate as 1 and 2. That's the same volume of CO2 that will form. However, experiment C, experiment 3 is at a higher temperature. So its rate must be higher, and that means it must have a steeper gradient. So if you look at B here, this gradient is the steepest. So that will probably mean that B is experiment 3. So now we've said D is experiment 2, A is experiment 4, B is experiment 3. So that means that experiment 1 must be graph C. Now, if you've analyzed it like this, You now just have to go and write it down in terms of how experiment 1 compares to each one of the other experiments. This is what came from the marking criteria. So they said for experiment 1 and 2, reaction in experiment 1 is faster than 2 due to a higher acid concentration. Remember in experiment 2, the concentration was 0.5 to the 1 for experiment 1. Therefore, the gradient of graph representing experiment 1 is greater or steeper. Then if we went with 1 against 3 and 4, the reaction in experiment 3 is faster than experiment 1 due to the higher temperature. The reaction in experiment 4 is faster than experiment 1 due to the higher temperature, as well as, remember, it had a greater mass, so there's also a larger surface area. Therefore, the gradient of the graphs of 3 and 4 are greater and steeper than that of experiment 1, which means final answer for experiment 1, it must be C. Now you can see that it is 6 marks. Now don't get scared when it's something like this. It just means that it's going to take you a bit longer to get to your answer, but you can reason it out. And it doesn't mean that you have to write it as it is on the marking criteria. All right, just try to make it logically follow on one another. Okay, and then the last, I think, part of this, when the reaction in experiment 4 reaches completion, and this is actually the part that I think most of you will hate. If you remember last year, also stoichiometric calculations, unfortunately, in all the reaction rate questions, they end with a stoichiometric calculation. So when the reaction in experiment 4 reaches completion, the volume of gas formed is 4.5 cubic decimeters. All right, so we have that. Assume that the molar gas volume at 40 degrees Celsius is equal to 25.7 cubic decimeters. So that is a molar volume, so it's so many cubic decimeters per mole. Calculate the mass of the impurities present in the calcium carbonate. Okay, so we want the mass of the impurities, and that would be actually the mass that does not react. The pure calcium carbonate would react. The impurities will be left over. So we will start with the given information of the volume, and we will work out what mole CO2 formed. So this is the formula of V over molar volume that is given to us on the formula sheet. So we get 0.18 moles of CO2. Then according to our balanced equation, we have to go and relate the calcium carbonate and the CO2 and see what is their ratio. And their ratio is a 1:1. So we can then say that the calcium carbonate's moles is equal to the mole of CO2. That is also going to be 0.18 mole. Now, please remember this part here. You have to write this relationship. And then you can, in brackets, if it's 1:1, just put it in there so that they know where you got to the fact that they are equal to one another. So now we know this is the amount of calcium carbonate that actually reacted to form the CO2. Okay, so if this was the reacted part, now we have to calculate the mass of the calcium carbonate that reacted. This was the mole amount that we now know. What was the mass? So now we go to the old N is M over big M, mass over molar mass, substitute your values in, and we get that the mass of calcium carbonate that reacted was 18 grams. Now in the beginning of the question, we were given how many calcium carbonate, or in the experiment, they gave us how many calcium carbonate was reacted with. So now we have to see how much was left over. If 18 grams reacted, we now have to see what was the impurities. They gave us in the experiment number 4 that we had 25 grams of calcium carbonate, but that was the impure part with what reacted. If we subtract the reacted part, then we get that the impure part that was left over is 7 grams. Okay, so what I actually need to tell you then, guys, is unfortunately when you study now for reaction rate, you have to go back to stoichiometric calculations from last year and make sure that you know your formulas and how to do these calculations as well. This is very quickly that I'm going to go through. They can give you again these type of graphs. Energy graph below of a reversible reaction and shows the changes in potential energy for the reaction. Define the term activation energy, right? Very quickly, minimum energy needed for a reaction to take place. Right, then they can ask you, write down the value of X. So this means you have to go and read off there. Now, if it's not very clear, they usually give you a little bit of a range in your answer. The easiest would have said, most of people would have said 40, but you might have guessed anything from 40 to 43. And then because they have a unit here, you actually can give the unit as kilojoules per mole. And I would suggest that you do, because there was a unit given on the axis there. Right, then they ask you, write down the name of the unstable transition state, the Y there. So that is a very easy one there. That's the activated complex. Next, they ask now something strange. Calculate the activation energy of the reverse reaction. Now, guys, that just means that we're now going to read from this way to there. All right? So calculate the activation energy of the reverse reaction. So that means we have to start here and take this as the reactants and go to still Y as the activated complex. So if we do that, we're going to have negative 50 and 40 that we work with. And remember, we always take the 40 minus the reactance value at the bottom, the negative 50. So the negative minus the negative will become a positive. And that gives us then an answer of 90. Now, the reason there was a range was because the 40 could have been anything from 40 to 43, like we had in the previous answer. Calculate the heat of reaction for the reverse reaction. Now, again, reverse reaction. So the reactants is now here on the right, and the products is now this part here. So delta H then means I have to work with the 10 and the negative 50. So this minus that, and that gives you then 60 kilojoules per mole. Now, this question that I just went through with you guys was in last year June. We had this in I think in one of the preparation June question papers. And then they ask you, is the reverse reaction endothermic or exothermic? Give a reason. Now, if you look at that answer is positive, right? So it's endothermic. And the easiest to answer that is to say that the delta H is greater than 0. All right, I'm going to go through a few of the multiple choice questions still with you. Sorry, here's one more question I want to go through with you. Sorry, 10 grams of calcium carbonate reacts with 20 cubic centimeters dilute hydrochloric acid, and the calcium carbonate is in excess. The diagram below represents an Erlenmeyer flask connected to the syringe in the gas, and the gas is collected. So the gas that's collected here would be the CO2. And the limiting reagent, if they say CO3 is excess, then the HCl will be our limiting reagent. The gas that is collected will then be the CO2. Right. Again, we have defined the rate of the reaction. Now, how will each of the following changes in conditions affect the rate of the reaction? Choose from increase, decrease, or remain the same. So if the calcium carbonate powder is replaced with lumps. Now, what did they do when they changed it from powder to lumps? Instead of making it more finely divided, they made it less divided. So they actually made the surface area not greater, but smaller. So what will be the effect? Not an increase, but a decrease in the reaction rate. Sorry, I went a bit too fast with that one. Eh? If the temperature of the HCl is increased, whenever they increase temperature, there will be an increase in the rate of the reaction. Then they ask you, use the collision theory to explain the answer to question 6.2.2. That was, how will an increase in temperature of the HCl influence the reaction rate? So now we have to explain that. Okay. So increase in temperature, increase the average kinetic energy of the particles. More particles will have sufficient kinetic energy. More effective collisions will take place per unit time. Right, so that's that same recipe that you have seen earlier, and you will see that, again, one of the ones that they ask the most is that increase in temperature. Right, then they give you a Maxwell-Boltzmann curve. The graph below represents the distribution curve for the above experiment. What is represented by the following letters? So what is represented by A? That line A is obviously the activation energy. What is represented by B? And B is the number of particles with sufficient or enough kinetic energy. So this is all straightforward theory that you can go and study. How will A shift when a catalyst is added? Choose from shift to the left or shift to the right. And we know the answer to that now. It will shift to the left. Redraw the above graph in your answer book and clearly indicate the following, how A and B will change if the temperature is increased. Okay, so we have the original curve. That was the original one. And then the new one. Okay, so what is important, A remains the same, right? But there was an increase in temperature. So this hill must just actually be a little bit lower, but it moved. And now you have here a bit of a bigger portion that is with sufficient kinetic energy. All right. Okay, again, guys, this is things that you can go and study. So these are marks that you really can get. The only places where they really can try and catch you out is with that stoichiometric calculations. But the rest is theory that you can go and study and that they really just ask in the same way over and over again. Calculate the average rate at which calcium carbonate reacts in grams per second. HCl is used up in 1.3 seconds. So that was our reaction. The HCl is the limiting reagent. So it's all about that HCl, and that's going to determine the CO2. So what was given in the sketch was the volume was 20 cubic centimeters and the concentration was 0.05 mole per cubic decimeters. They did give us the mass of the calcium carbonate as 10 grams. So if we then start to calculate the mole of the hydrochloric acid using C is N over V, important thing to remember is that this volume was in cubic centimeters. So you have to multiply it by 10 to the negative 3 to turn it into cubic decimeters. So that's a place where they try to catch you out, right? And then you get that the mole of HCl is 0,001. Now, according to your reaction, the mole of calcium carbonate and the moles of HCl, so if you look at what we have here, they actually in a 1:2 ratio. So the calcium carbonate will be half of what the HCl will be. Right, again, I used to indicate my ratio there next to it when I do the calculation. So the moles of calcium carbonate will then be 0,0005 moles. Okay, from that, we can go and work out what mass of the calcium carbonate actually reacted. And that was 0,05. But we started with 10 grams of calcium carbonate. So if 0,05 reacted, then we are left now with 9,95. Remember, for reaction rate, they wanted us to give it in grams per second. So we needed to know what was the change in mass. So we needed to know what was the initial mass and what was the final mass of the calcium carbonate. That's why we had to work out what reacted and what is left over. Now we can go and write the rate is going to be minus the change in mass over the change in time. So my end value of mass was this, minus the initial value. They said that the reaction took 1,3 seconds. Remember, then we started with 0. You have to show your initial and final values, and then we end. And our unit must be in grams per second. Right, so there we've also done our calculation where you actually had to go and work out the rate of the reaction. Okay. Multiple choice question. This one recently in one of our recent question papers. I feel I have to show you this because this is a tricky one that they ask us, and a lot of guys struggled with it. If you look at this, they give you that we are moving, I just want to get this, that we actually have from A to B, that delta H is negative 130. Then from B to C, it's plus 80. And then we have from D to C, negative 25. And then I ask us now here, identify the type of energy reactions between A to D. Now, A to D, that's this part here. And then from D to B, so now we have to go from here to there. And then from C to A. Okay. Sorry, I have now messed up a bit. Okay, so how are we going to do this? I have to now do a calculation here. Now I want you guys to see if we go from A to D. This is not a straightforward calculation. We have to actually work out from A to B, then from B to C, and then from C to D. So if we go from A to B, that gives me minus 130. If I go from B to C, that gives me now plus 80. Now comes the problem. I now go from C to D. So this is the reverse reaction. So I can't say now minus 25. I now have to say plus 25. Now, I hope my math is good enough for this one. That's 105. All right, so this will give me minus 25 to go from A to D. Now, if that is a negative, that means that is going to be exothermic. You see what we did? To go from A to D, we had to follow this whole path all the way to there. So now already I know it can not be this one. Okay, but that leaves me now with A, B, or D. Right, I just want to quickly take all of this away. Right, what's our next one? We have to go from D to B. Okay, looks a little bit easier, not so much. So that means I have to go from D to C, and then from C to B. Okay, D to C, straightforward. That was what they gave me. That's the minus 25. But C to D is again in reverse. So I can't use the plus 80. I have to work with minus 80. So that will give me negative 105. And that is again exothermic. So now if I look at the second column here, that one is out and that one is out. I don't even have to do the next one because I already have an exo and an exo. So that means my answer is B. So ladies and gentlemen, this was a very tricky one that they asked recently in one of the question papers. So I hope that you will be ready if you have something like this next time in the exams. You will know how to tackle it. Okay, let's look at the next one. Reaction rate between two gases is likely to be the greatest under conditions of. Now, you never, ever, ever go and look at A, B, C, and D before you already have your own answer. We're working with gases. Now, when we want to increase a reaction rate with gases, then there's a few things that we can do. Something that we can always increase reaction rate is temperature. Another thing with gases that can increase is pressure, or increase in pressure or a decrease in volume. So you first go and tell yourself what is the things that can increase for gases reaction rate. Now you go and find those things. Okay, and this must be an increase and this must be an increase. Where do I find this? That's very easy. Where do you see that? Hey. Now, if you first had to go read through all of them and then make a choice, you would have wasted so much time. So, ladies and gentlemen, remember when you do multiple choice, first get your own answer, then it's much easier to get it and you don't get confused because they always try to confuse you with multiple choice questions. Okay, let's look at this one. Which one of the reaction rate versus time graphs below best represent the reaction rate between magnesium and the excess of hydrochloric acid? Okay, so you have magnesium and diluted hydrochloric acid. So if the diluted hydrochloric acid is in excess, yeah, and you look at these reactions, then there will be more than enough hydrochloric acid to drive this reaction that it's very fast. Now let's quickly look at this. This one definitely is wrong. Why? Because if a reactant, a product starts, it starts at 0 and it increases. No? So that's wrong. Okay, it can possibly be this one, can possibly be that one, can possibly be this one. All right. Now, if I would make a bet, because I have a very, very large amount of diluted hydrochloric acid, the reaction will be very, very steep here and most probably will stop. Why? Magnesium is a solid. And the best bet for collecting data with a solid would be to look at the mass and how the mass decreases. And most probably that mass would go down to 0. So it should be between A or C. Now I hope I guessed right. Yes, I did. It was C. All right. Okay, let's look at this one. A strip of zinc metal placed in a solution of hydrochloric acid of a concentration of 4 mole per cubic decimeter. Hydrogen gas forms as one of the products. Which one of the following will not, this is important, will not affect the rate at which the hydrogen gas is released from the beaker? So what will not affect it? Né? We so quickly want to look for something that will affect it. Right, so if we add another zinc strip, what do? If we add another zinc strip, we actually make the surface area bigger. So that will affect that reaction rate. There will be more zinc to react. Okay. Addition of more 4 mole per cubic decimeters of this, that's a question mark. We have more of that we add. We'll come back to that. Use zinc powder. Okay, we had a zinc strip. If we use powder, it's more finely divided, so it will affect it. So we can't use this one, definitely. We can't use that one because it will affect it. Using 2 moles per cubic decimeters instead of 4. Smaller concentration, that will affect the rate. It will decrease it. So it seems like this is the correct one. Now, why, if I add more of the same concentration, will it not have an effect? Now, I think you guys must remember that if you add more of the same concentration, it's not only the number of particles that you increase, but it's also the volume that you increase. So that's why in the end, it will have no effect on your reaction rate. So your answer there is B. Thank you, guys. At this stage, I can tell you all the best for the exams.